Welcome to Monday's Mental Mistakes. This week we're looking at the distinction bias. Here's a simple example. Suppose that you are a keen poet who has written a book of poetry. You put the book up for sale, and after a while you check in and find one of the following scenarios has occurred. So far, no one has bought your book. So far, 80 people have bought your book. So far, 160 people have bought your book. So far, 240 people have bought your book. On a scale of 1 to 9, where 1 is extremely unhappy and 9 is extremely happy, how happy would each of these scenarios make you? In particular, how happy would you be in the scenario in which you have sold 80 books? If you felt that you would be unhappy if you only sold 80 books, then congratulations, you suffer from the distinction bias. There are many reasons why you might have been unhappy having sold 80 books, but when people are asked about only this scenario, and the others aren't mentioned, they tend to predict that they will be happy in this scenario, rather than unhappy. This graph shows the results of asking a number of people to rate how happy they would be in each scenario. The black line with triangles is when people were presented with all 4 options, like I did here. Notice that the second scenario has an average rating of 3.34 out of 9. The dashed line with circles is when people were only presented with one of the scenarios. Notice that the second scenario has an average rating of 7.14 out of 9. The key point to note here is how steep the black line is and how flat the dashed line is. This shows that when we evaluate the 4 scenarios together, we expect them to produce quite different levels of happiness. But when we consider each scenario separately, we actually find them to be far more similar. The tendency to focus on differences when evaluating together rather than separately is the distinction bias. The distinction bias is the tendency to see items as more different when they're evaluated together. That is, differences seem more pronounced when judging items simultaneously. The distinction bias makes us more likely to overestimate the importance of differences when directly comparing things. At the same time, we are unlikely to recognise the extent of differences when comparing items separately. The principal way to counter the distinction bias is to compare options both separately and together. By using both evaluations, we can reduce the effect of the distinction bias. Another useful approach is to evaluate options in the way that they will be experienced. So, if you will only ever experience one of the options, it can be distorting to compare it side to side with other options. For example, one reason for putting a large range of televisions on display is that it encourages comparisons between them. And because you can see many at once, the distinction bias ensures that you will overemphasize the differences in picture quality. This puts pressure on you to purchase a more expensive television than you otherwise would. To counter this, it might be helpful to focus only on televisions within a predetermined price range, or to use reviews of picture quality as a guide rather than your own perception. In this case, you will end up watching only one television at once, and so the differences in picture quality that you see in the shop are not representative of your actual experience at home. The distinction bias occurs more strongly when there is a quantitative difference between outcomes. For example, suppose that you have to choose between an interesting job that pays $50,000 and a tedious job that pays $70,000. The difference in the enjoyment of the work is qualitative, and so we're unlikely to overestimate how significant this is. But the difference in salaries is quantitative, and so we are more likely to overestimate its value. Hence, if you do choose incorrectly, we are more likely to choose the tedious but well-paid job over the interesting but low-paid. This also provides another method to counter the distinction bias. By thinking of the jobs as well-paid and low-paid, we have shifted the salary from a quantitative difference to a qualitative difference and reduced the effect of the distinction bias. The distinction bias is directly analogous to the contrast effect. The contrast effect is when we perceive stimuli as stronger when juxtaposed with contrasting stimuli. So bright colours look brighter when next to dull colours, and loud noises sound louder after quiet ones. The distinction bias is an equivalent effect, but on judgments rather than perceptions. And while there may be similar processes underlying both, the research is far too early to say. In conclusion, the distinction bias is the tendency to overestimate the differences in options when evaluating them together rather than separately. Until next week, may your mental mistakes be minor.